The Renters' Rights Act does give tenants new rights to request to have a pet in the property, and a landlord is not permitted to unreasonably refuse. And it's a fairly simple set of rules. So where a tenant does want to request to have a pet, this request must be made to the landlord in writing, and it must provide a description of the pet. Now, the landlord must provide a response to this request within 28 days. But within those 28 days, the landlord is able to request further information from the tenant about the pet, and the tenant must provide that further information within 7 days. The landlord does not need to consent or refuse permission for the tenant to have a pet until the tenant has responded to the landlord's request for further information. In circumstances where superior landlord consent is required to have a pet in the property, the landlord does not need to respond to the tenant's request until they have the superior landlord response, and upon receiving the superior landlord response, the landlord must respond to the tenant's request within 7 days of receiving the superior landlord's response. The Act does allow the landlord and tenant to agree to an extension of time, and there's no limitation on what extension might be agreed. Now, these rules do apply even where the tenant does not own the pet. And quite crucially, the Act does not prohibit the landlord and tenant entering into an agreement with specific pet-related terms. Now, the Act also sets out circumstances in which the landlord may refuse consent for the tenant to have a pet in the property. Now, those circumstances are where the landlord granting consent for the tenant to have a pet would cause the landlord to be in breach of their superior lease, or where superior landlord consent is required and the landlord has taken reasonable steps to obtain that consent but has not managed to obtain it. Now, this does not appear to be an exhaustive list of circumstances in which the landlord could refuse consent, because the wording in the Act, our circumstances include those two examples which we've just given. So that does suggest that the circumstances in which a landlord may refuse to give the tenant consent to have a pet in the property is not limited to those circumstances. Now, where a tenant alleges the landlord has breached their obligations under these rules, such as perhaps failing to respond to a written request within the required timescale, or where the tenant alleges the refusal to allow them to have a pet was unreasonable, the court does have the power to order the landlord to provide a response and also to determine whether a refusal was unreasonable or not. So essentially, a court can determine whether or not a tenant is allowed to have a pet in the property or not. So those are the rules in relation to a tenant's right to request a pet and how a landlord must deal with that request.